we're given a choice between being selfish and selfless. And so a new term that I introduced is the idea of being self-full. The ability to put ourselves first and to get what we need to fill up our cups so that we're then able to be in a position to give and to be at a place of our highest potential.
Thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me. Now I get to be on the other side of the interview. I love it.
Yeah, we're gonna keep you busy here today, right? That's true. That's good. So you recently published a book, The 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People, which is really, and you mentioned the subtitle. It's either Flourish or Fold. Like, what's the secret behind that? It's viewed at number 3 in Barnes and Noble. That's huge.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Very impressive. Very impressive. Right. So, obviously, the topic of resilience resonates with people. What did you find out about that? Why? How did you get interested in this topic? What was your inspiration?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. So, one of the interesting things about writing a book is the opportunity for reflection. And so my editor had asked me, so my editor worked with Brene Brown when she published her book, Daring Greatly. And so we felt like she was really the right person to help us steward this book into becoming a reality. And she said, one of the things that people are going to want to know is how you got interested in resilience. And so when I sat down to write that part, it came out very different than what I'd been saying. So I had been saying that in graduate school, I began working with women that were in the rural areas of Maryland. I was in graduate school at the University of Maryland. And so we were doing qualitative interviews with them on what it was like to be in a rural area. These were women that were struggling with financial solvency, with food sustainability, with their families. And so we ended up writing an article on what were the factors that enhanced or detracted from their resilience. And from there, I went on and did a fellowship that was funded by the NIH, where I worked with people that had had traumatic brain injuries and spinal cord injuries, and what were the things that allowed people to restore their lives and rehabilitate. So some of you might be thinking, what's the thread to HR and to developing people? And what I realized is I went through a number of challenges earlier on, a decade before. All of that happened when I was 14. So what I realized at age 37 is I was diagnosed with dyslexia. And I had gone through all of my schooling and graduate schooling without any accommodations. So if you're walking through the airport, just a public service announcement, and you read wood-fried pizza, you might be dyslexic. Because I'll walk by signs all the time and be like, oh, is that a new thing they're offering? Here, no, it's wood-fired pizza. So not wood-fried pizza. And so that is, a challenge that I faced early on. I also experienced some trauma with a stalker. I talk about that in my TED Talk, and I developed 2 decades of PTSD as a result of that. And so I think so often the things that we do in our lives are often, the momentum is created by those early experiences. And so I very much at 14, not at 24, was already thinking about how do we as humans effectively face challenge? And I think that's really what resilience is. There's a lot of misnomers about what resilience is, what it means. The definition in the book is to be able to effectively face the inevitable moments of challenge, change, and complexity, or the 3 C's as I call them, and to move through those inevitable moments in our lives, being ultimately enhanced by those experiences, not diminished. And that's the full definition of what resilience means. And I've also uncovered something that's really important, and this is said early on in the book, that's really a foundation of resilience, which is that resilience is the essence of being human. because the way that we've talked about resilience is as though it's something outside of ourselves, something we've got to go find, something we've got to harness, uncover. And what we realize is that this is actually inextricably tied to our humanity. And when we shift that script to move from resilience is something out here to resilience is something in here, that really changes the game. You know, first of all, it's very much related to how we think about developing people, how we think about coaching our senior people, right? It's not about developing something new necessarily. It's about finding to a greater degree the strengths and talents that already exist within us.
There's a lot there. You know, one of my theories is that they're everyday heroes. There's a lot of people dealing with a lot of struggles on a daily basis. They don't have a big red S on their chest. They're definitely superheroes, and you explained some of your challenges and how you overcame them. So you spoke about resilience in your book. One of the good ways to find something is explain to people what it is not. You know, what did you find out when you were reflecting on this? What was untrue about resilience?
Yeah, so that definition that I mentioned about resilience, I think is powerful with, you know, because what's written on the page, if you will, and what's as powerful is what's not there. And so what's not a part of that definition, and this is a myth of resilience, is so often we've made resilience synonymous with bouncing back, with going back to a prior state. And so Sylvia and Crystal and I were talking about this morning, and you know, early on, you know, I'd have sort of people waiting for me at the corners of the stage when I would do a keynote, and you know, they'd say like, I think I demonstrated resilience, but so anyway, I'm not the same person that I was before. And so there's this belief, this widely held belief that in order to be resilient, we have to go back to a prior state. And you know, so my doctorate degree is in neuropsychology, and so what I get to bring into this conversation is, you know, the ways that our body and brain works to help some of this make sense. And so, you know, all of us here, I think, have probably read at least one article on neuroplasticity. And so if we think about neuroplasticity, our brain is constantly rewiring, you know, regenerating neurons, regrouping to be able to respond to what's happening in terms of our external experience. And so if every external experience that we have relative to neuroplasticity changes us fundamentally, changes us down to the cellular level, the neurological or neural level, why would we ever think that we would go back to the way we were before something happened? And so one of the myths that we get to debunk is this idea that rather than bouncing back, we bounce forward. We take the full complement of that experience, you know, whether we would have chosen it or not, and oftentimes it's not, and allow that to enhance us over time and then be formed into the next version of ourselves or the next version of our leaders, or how we're forming our people into what they're developing into and growing into.
I like that approach better. It's a constant evolution. No going backwards. That's great. So, spoiler alert, okay, we're going to jump in here. Still want you to read the book, not part of your homework, but what are those 5 qualities, central qualities of resilient people?
Yeah, bless you. So, you're welcome. So,
wow, you're in everything. So this is multitasking.
I'm connected to my audience out here. Yeah. So, you know, the 5 practices of highly resilient people the book's been out for 90 days. So you're on the ground floor, coming in, the ground floor. And it did debut as the number 3 book in the world on Barnes & Noble, which was super exciting. Thank you.
Can't get tired of that.
Can't get tired of that. We were ahead of Arnold Schwarzenegger's memoir for like 5 minutes. You know, but you know how Arnold is, you know, he was like, I'll be back. And then he skyrocketed ahead of us. But yeah, he was back. Yeah. So this is really based on, you know, 2 decades of me sitting down with people, now interviewing hundreds of people and collecting thousands of pieces of data on how we effectively face challenges, and asking people, you know, when you faced a challenge, what did you do that you felt created a productive or positive outcome? And then listening to those stories. And so, as you know, qualitative research isn't about, us as the researcher deciding for people what happened. It's about hearing it from their perspective and doing our best to understand, what that means for each person. And so, having interviewed hundreds of people and collected thousands of pieces of data on this, the 5 practices emerged. And so it's a very robust empirical framework. And so the 5 practices, to give just a high-level description, which I was so excited to bring into the world, because I think every time we face these inevitable moments of challenge, change, and complexity, whether it's personally or professionally, there's some voice in our head or in the heads of our people that's saying, what am I going to do? What's the next step? And I thought, what if we knew what to do? What if in that moment there was some kind of a playbook or a roadmap that helped us in that moment of chaos and ambiguity? And so that is the 5 practices. And so the first practice, I write about this in the book, I was surprised by, and many people are surprised by, and also convicted by. And the first practice is vulnerability. And so vulnerability after resilience is maybe the next most misunderstood kind of word or concept. Because vulnerability, the way it came through, it's not transparency. It's not putting everything out there for everyone to see. What vulnerability is to the greatest extent possible, allowing our inside self, our thoughts, feelings, and emotions to match the outside self that we share with the world. And in psychology, we call that congruence. And so vulnerability is important in moments of challenge for 2 reasons. One, if we're feeling some kind of way on the inside, and then, expressing to people or covering that up and being something else on the outside, we're essentially running 2 human operating systems at the same time. And so when we run 2 operating systems on our computer or on a device, what happens? It crashes, it slows down. And so in that moment, when we're facing a challenge, when we most need that sort of energetic and emotional capital, if we're not being vulnerable and the inside self is not matching the outside self, we're really expending a lot of energy to run 2 operating systems. And the second thing that happened with vulnerability is that people that were vulnerable to share what they were going through, they actually received more support, more information, more knowledge, more guidance, because people could come around them in those moments and help them. But the thing about vulnerability is it's really hard. And so I started thinking, okay, well, Brene Brown talks about vulnerability, and Brene says it's good. I mean, why not? And so I thought, like, okay, so why aren't we all now like living our most fabulous vulnerable life? And so what I uncovered is this thing called the vulnerability bias. And the vulnerability bias appears to be like an irrational fear. So every time we think about being vulnerable with someone, and by the way, vulnerability is the cornerstone or the precursor to authentic leadership, to empathetic leadership. We're talking about AI and the importance of the human connection. We can't be authentic or empathetic as a person or as a leader without first tapping into something vulnerable that exists within us, right? So the vulnerability bias is a voice in most people's heads that in that moment when we sort of step out to be seen and known to a greater degree, that voice says, no, don't do that. That's a terrible idea, And we're like, really? And the voice is like, yeah, you're not gonna wanna do that. And it goes on to sort of say, if you're vulnerable, the 3 L's will occur. People won't like us, they won't love us, and they might leave. And that's a powerful prohibition to not demonstrate a sense of vulnerability. And then on top of that, authenticity or empathy, which is tied to that. And so there's a process that we all get to go through as humans and as leaders and with our people to be able to unpack that vulnerability bias, to face that fear, and to figure out how we step out in that vulnerability in a way that's in service, to our people and to our organization.
Maybe that's motivation for stepping out, because you're doing this as a service to other people.
Yeah, it can be.
You're on that edge. I don't know if I want to do this, but you can't stand to help people. Great
That's right.
reason for doing it.
Yeah, oftentimes the things that we can't do for ourselves, sometimes we can do for others, you know? Yeah.
So one of the things I love about this format is, peer-to-peer education. You're going to learn from people at your table, people from the stage, something else, from their experiences. Now, Taryn, you've been around the world coaching individuals and companies on resiliency, wellness, well-being. They're all tied together.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the takeaways? I mean, we could profit a lot from hours and hours of experience you have speaking to people around the world. What are some of the takeaways that we could share with our audience?
Yeah, I think, so I think something that's really timely with this work on resilience, and it feels like such an honor to really have done this work for a long period of time and then have it be in a place where it's such a service to, I think, where we are with humanity today. So I think for many organizations, what we're seeing is this evolution of how we're thinking about employee wellness, well-being, mental health, and many organizations are moving from, we just need to do things that don't adversely impact our employees, right? We don't want to, have people working long hours. We're going to try to refrain from sending emails after hours. We want to give people time to rest and restore. Versus, sort of along that continuum and that evolution, I think we're really seeing wellness and well-being for many organizations as a strategic imperative to how we think about retention, engagement, being a talent magnet in the marketplace. And so this work on resilience really drives mental health and well-being and gives people the tools, the 5 practices, to be able to do that for themselves, for their teams, and then to cascade this more broadly across the organization. So I know I just only shared one practice with you, which was vulnerability. You'll have to read the book to get the rest. Which, by the way, I am delighted to sign your book if you would like me to do that. As an author, I don't think anyone else had published in here. As an author, your greatest hope and dream is that someone who's not related to you by blood or marriage will want you to sign their book, and they might read it. So just know that if I sign your book, you're like fulfilling my greatest dream as an author. But I'll tell you, just to give an example, because we're all about, I think, practical implementation here. And so, gosh, I'm even embarrassed saying this out loud. So I'm working with an organization currently where they were using the 7 habits of highly effective people. That was really their framework for the book they gave out to new employees. They had a lot of their programming and their university built out around this. And so their chief HR officer and I connected. We did a pilot with the 5 practices of highly resilient people inside of their organization with a workshop and some training for senior leaders and a keynote across, to sort of cascade and introduce these ideas. And so what they're doing now is they're actually transitioning from the 7 practices of highly resilient people, or 7 practices of highly effective people, to the 5 practices of highly resilient people. And they're making this is what they're rallying around inside of their organization to develop resilience. So it's
that was
a huge honor.
My wrap-up question too is maybe that's the answer, or probably have a lot more examples. But what's inspiring you right now about the work you're doing? What gets you up in the morning, springing your step as you want to cure the world, one resiliency case at a time?
Yeah. Well, and I'm so curious to talk to so many of you today and at the breaks, and to learn how you're thinking about this work and what's happening inside of your organizations. I think there's a lot of people, who are really struggling or still really struggling. I think there was this viewpoint that we were going to kind of get through a hard time, and then the path was going to be made clear, and we were going to go back to normal and everything. And it just hasn't, and I think more than ever before in my lifetime and many of our lifetimes, we ourselves in this room are carrying such a heavy cognitive load of caring for ourselves, caring for our families, caring for our organizations, shouldering all of that. And, then on top of that, what's happening in the media, the war with Ukraine and Russia, climate change, and just a pervasive sense of continued challenge. And so there's exhaustion, there's burnout. And so getting to show up in this time, right, and to be of service around how do we leverage these 5 practices, really unpack what resilience is and what it isn't, and then practically be able to implement these practices to support people in amplifying their resilience, in guarding against burnout, stress, and exhaustion, and being able to amplify, well-being, wellness, and mental health inside of organizations is just a really wonderful honor.
Yeah, no, it sounds very inspirational, and you bring up a good point that it falls on the shoulders of a lot of you to make sure the companies are prospering, that psychologically people feel safe, and protecting their well-being. But we were speaking about this before. There's a metaphor I'd like to bring up. When you go on an airplane, they talk about the oxygen mask. It's kind of intuitive, but please put your mask on first before you put the mask on others, and because you want to help other people, but you're no good to them if you pass out there in the middle of the airplane. So, to all of you as well, you got to take care of yourselves to be able to take care of your company. It's a huge contribution you made to speak out about resilience, Taryn, and thank you for that. I want to round of applause for Taryn.
Thank
Any parting words of advice to for this, which is not a journey, it's not a destination, it's a journey of resilience.
Yeah. I'll just add one more thing before we bring Steve up on stage. Steve, where are you? Steve, beautiful. Okay. So we're going to bring Steve up next, which we're so excited about. And so one thing I'll just add based on your airplane metaphor is I was also thinking as I was writing the book, what's a new way that we can talk about how to take care of ourselves? And one of the things that I talk about, there's a chapter about women, not that women need resilience and men don't, but we have a lot of women leadership development programs because we know that a woman's journey across her career looks and feels very different than it does for men. And so there's some unique opportunities there as we think about amplifying resilience for women in leadership. And so I was thinking about what's maybe another metaphor that we can use there. And I learned that each of us have a heart, obviously, and that heart is pumping blood through our body. And so when the heart, cleans and oxygenates the blood, what organ does the heart first pump that clean, oxygenated blood to? The heart first pumps that cleaned, oxygenated blood to itself. Because in the wisdom of the body, we cannot survive without the heart, even for a moment. We can go a while without the brain working.
Some people do.
So that's another really powerful way where we can think about just how meaningful it is. We're given a choice between being selfish and selfless. And so a new term that I introduced is the idea of being self-full. The ability to put ourselves first and to get what we need to fill up our cups so that we're then able to be in a position to give and to be at a place of our highest potential. And so you can also think about how the heart first pumps that cleaned, oxygenated blood to itself and the importance of sustaining ourselves with the lifeblood that we need.
Well, thank you. Fantastic. It's good.
Thank
good
you.
Job. Right.
Thank you.
For all of you listening in to Flourish or Fold Stories of Resilience, I want to share with you an online course that we have on our website. We're going to go ahead and drop the website in our show notes, Or you can go to www.resilience-leadership.com and check out our offerings. We've got an incredible course for you called Flourish, the 5 practices of highly resilient people. So if you love what you're learning about in this podcast, if you love these conversations on resilience, if you love hearing about how you can more effectively face the inevitable moments of challenge, change, and complexity, or the 3 C's as I call them, in your life, then go ahead and check out our online course, Flourish, the 5 practices of highly resilient people, because what you are going to find is a one-on-one tutorial with me around each of those 5 practices, as well as an introduction and a conclusion. We've got hours of content that is going to allow you to engage in direct coaching and learning with me on the 5 practices. Go ahead and check it out, and I hope you'll join us in our online course, Flourish, the 5 practices of highly resilient people.